We are live. Welcome, everyone, to the second ever Sacred Heart Christian Creators Fireside Chat. Our goal is to have these monthly, although in in July we took a break. Michael Snellen was busy, and I was busy. I'm your host, by the way, Aaron Kessler. I'm a filmmaker. Uh, And yeah, and today we have Michael Walker. So, Michael Walker, tell us a little bit about yourself. You're a published author. You've published at least one novel on Amazon, and yeah. So, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, so good to be with you again, Aaron. It's always nice to see an old friend and collaborator. Yeah, I wrote a novel called Galahad, and it is about the uh, knight in King Arthur's court who discovered the Holy Grail. I noticed that there was a big gap in modern retellings of Arthurian legends of Galahad. Usually there's more focus on the more popular character, Sir Percival. And the
Hmm.
earlier Arthurian legends, I think Wagner wrote a whole opera called Parsifal. And they tend to focus on that character. But then the later Arthurian legends, there were a lot of Cistercian influences. And they thought, a lot of these knights, they're heroic, in a classical epic sense, but they all have like these grave moral flaws, which can make for compelling literature. But is that necessarily the best exemplar or would you take life advice from these characters? And so the monks kind of devised this character of Galahad. Some say he was based on a real saint with a similar name. I think when you kind of delve into Celtic lore and legend, I think there's a compelling argument to make that it could have some sort of historical basis. But I thought, we're living in an age of doubt and despair, and a lot of changes are happening in society, and he could be a good example for young people to navigate life's challenges. So I thought it was high time to, kind of have a modern look at this ancient kind of knight and saint. And yeah, it was published with En route, or I guess that's the French pronunciation, and En route publications back in 2024, last year. And
So it sounds like Galahad. I've actually never really explored the tale of Galahad. It sounds like he was a man trying to live upright, valiantly, virtuously in a world that's kind of a bit noir, a bit gone wrong. There's maybe a little bit of cynicism and despair over reaching these lofty ideals, and yet he sets out and tries to reach them. And what a tale that is for our modern day when we live in very much so the same kind of world.
Yeah, what do they say? What's old is new. And I
Mhm.
find, creatively speaking, and I know this is something we discussed about, talking about today for our audience, when you're looking for inspiration, sometimes reaching into the past is the way to move the art form forward. And you see that with a lot of the great writers and artists, even going back to Homer. When he wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, those were long ago historical events. People tend to forget that because Homer was writing 2,000 years later. It's the same thing with Virgil writing the Aeneid, and he was writing about the historical foundations of Rome. To put it into modern context, it would be roughly akin to if a author in the 21st century were to write an epic poem about the founding of America. That seems like, the dustbin of history to us, but
Mhm.
then you go to Europe and 1776 was yesterday. So it's all a matter of context and framing. You're on mute there, Aaron. or maybe it's the.
Yes, I am on mute. Absolutely. Sorry, I had to. Yeah. So can you summarize the story of Galahad?
Yeah.
Yeah, like
So
just like a little quick like DVD synopsis for myself and those in the audience who don't know anything about it.
yeah, I guess I don't want to spoil it too much, although some, we might have varying degrees of familiarity with Arthurian legend. Galahad was reputed to be the son of Lancelot, who's a more famous Arthurian knight, probably maybe infamous for his adulterous affair with Guinevere, who was King Arthur's wife, even though Lancelot was Arthur's best knight and best friend. So it really kind of shows, there was a bizarre love triangle going on there. But Lancelot got around. He was the father of Galahad, and they put the boy up for adoption because his parents were elsewhere. So he was raised, so the legend goes, at a monastery, kind of as an oblate. We don't really have that as a social function in society today. It used to be that houses of religion or monasteries, might take in a foundling child by adoption and raise them. And then when they were of the age of majority, they could decide whether they wanted to remain at the monastery or go out into the world. So when Galahad was 18, 21, somewhere around there, he decided he wanted to become a knight. And I think where the modern retelling element comes in is, he may have had some vague awareness of his parentage. And I think it was a source of insecurity for him. So when he went to Camelot and became one of King Arthur's knights, he actually jousts, against his own father, Lancelot, so that's kind of a pivotal moment. But he's sent forth by Arthur on the basis of that joust to find the Holy Grail because, and again, I'm not sure how familiar people are these days with what the Holy Grail meant within the legends of Great Britain, but there is a myth that Saint Joseph of Arimathea caught the blood of Christ from his side at the crucifixion, and that the cup had been used at the Last Supper. And when he and Saint Mary Magdalene traveled to France and then to Great Britain, or what we modern day people know as Great Britain, somehow the Grail as a relic of the crucifixion was buried there. So there's all sorts of, that's inspired writers and artists for centuries, the Pre-Raphaelites, the medievals. And I really kind of wanted to contribute my own voice to that pantheon.
Absolutely. Can you tell us about the time in which Galahad is set? Like, can you describe what life was like in that era? What were some of the like driving cultural forces? What were some of the challenges? What were some of the how would you contrast it with today's age?
That's a fascinating question. Two things occur to me. I think the road answer that most, more secular critics might give you is Thomas Hobbes. Nasty. The life back then was nasty, brutish, and short. And depending on what part of the world you're in today, the same could be said. It was definitely a feudal society. I think there was a sort of caste system where everybody knew their place. God was in his heavens, the hangman was at his gallows, that kind of high social hierarchy. In some ways, I think that mirrors or at least has analogs to our own era as well. That, not that we're in a caste system or a class society, but sometimes the notion of upward mobility or meritocracy is challenged, and your ability to navigate isn't necessarily correlated to your moral worth, and I think Galahad presents that challenge because and you see this even with the pagan, the pre-Christian sorts of myths and legends. There's always this character who Well, I think specifically of Sophocles with Oedipus Rex. He has to become the king and heal the plague, that is the scourge of his people. But in that sense, he almost has to take on the curse of the people. I mean,
Mm.
the culmination of all these, myths we see with Christ, he had to become the shibboleth, he had to become the scapegoat, where he took on the sin of all mankind. And I think there's something like that going on with Galahad as well. Obviously, not to the same level, but the Grail quest, it's a blessing because only the pure could behold the vision of God, as the Gospels say. But it's also a curse because it meant a sort of isolation from temporal society and worldly concerns, and kind of exploring that light and shadow. Was a fascinating journey for me, and I would hope for the reader. I don't know if that answers your question in a roundabout way, but
Yeah,
or maybe.
definitely. So it's almost like, I wonder if you could make a parallel between the story of Galahad and joining a religious order, particularly a cloistered religious order. You leave society and you go on this sort of spiritual internal adventure, and you're searching for the Holy Grail. You're searching for Christ Himself.
Exactly. I couldn't have said it better myself. And, to be fair, there's obviously a lot in the Arthurian legends to appeal to a more faith-based audience. But intriguingly for me, it has a lot of popularity in the more secular New Age circles as well, because I think when they hear the Holy Grail, you know, I don't know how familiar you are with the quadriga, or the fourfold sense of scripture and
Mm.
also some literature. So basically, you can take any text and you can interpret it on the literal level, the metaphorical level, the anagogical level, the topological level. And I think the Arthurian legends lend themselves to this sort of interpretation because on the literal level, the Holy Grail is the cup that our Lord used at the Last Supper and that caught his blood at the crucifixion. But it can take all sorts of other valences and layers of meaning, semiotic intention that isn't necessarily contradictory to the literal meaning. Um, I think that's why it's taken on in broader society this sort of mythic, metaphorical power. So no matter what your field of pursuit is, people say, "Oh, this is the Holy Grail." We're looking for this. We're looking for that. Everyone's on a quest, whether they're religious or not. And so I think it does have a sort of broad-based appeal from that perspective.
Absolutely. But I think the reason I brought up the religious was that it seems like there's an element of the transcendent that maybe that's an interesting discussion, whether or not if you want to become a renowned lawyer, like maybe you want to argue cases before the Supreme Court. Is there an element of the transcendent in that? I don't know the answer to that. That's a very fascinating question.
Yeah, you know what it makes me think of, and this is going to seem like, totally at a right angle from everything we've been discussing. James Dean, the kind of he's attained a sort of mythical status, I think, in the at least the American subconscious. As you see the famous poster of him, Rebel Without a Cause, and supposedly, he died maybe over 50 years ago now, but he said that if a man can be remembered after he dies, maybe he was a great man. So I think there is that quest for immortality in any worldly pursuit. It's always pointing towards a world beyond, that it's not self-limiting.
Mm.
In Dean's case, he always harbored this ambition to visit Europe, and he never got the opportunity. But one of his co-stars in Rebel Without a Cause visited Europe and saw his after he died, and saw his poster everywhere. So that really struck him that he did get to go, but not in this life.
Yeah, fascinating. You think of so many saints and even some artists who just they lived very, very unknown lives, and then after they're dead, it's like then they really have time to blossom. It's very, very fascinating. I suppose you could look at it in a pessimistic sort of way, but only if you don't believe in a if you don't believe in an afterlife, you know.
Well,
Um,
you mentioned a hidden life there, Aaron. Not to turn the tables here, but being a filmmaker, I forget if we've discussed this before. Have you seen a hidden life? What's your
I have,
opinion, if you don't?
yeah. It had. I saw it when it was out in theaters. I thought it was too. I didn't really like the super long contemplative shots, like 10-second shots of the countryside, which is kind of Malik's style of just like silent contemplation. Maybe I'm not. Maybe I haven't worked on my own interior life well enough to get to a point where I can sit through that in a film and appreciate it. But I'm much more, like my movie plots to be very concentrated, and his are very just like spread out, kind of slice of life, very very subdued. So the style of the film was not to my taste at all. Um, I don't remember much about what was, the actual content. It was a very, that being said, it was very brilliantly examining the slice of life, very much like what is it, it's a very different approach, I think, to a World War II topic, to kind of zoom in on just a normal person's life at the time, in Germany at the time of the Nazis' rise to power. Was he Germany or Austria? I can't remember.
I can't remember either.
I think it was Germany, but I could be wrong. But anyway, under the Nazi occupation, just a life of an average person, um, and to show what the quiet, unknown struggles of his life are. So it was brilliant in that regard, I think. But it's hard for me to like really properly appreciate the rest of the film because it was in a style that didn't really like resonate with me very much.
Yeah, I could see that. For a bit of context, I think it was the last film I saw in theaters before COVID shut them all down. And I was definitely moved by it, but I think for a variety of reasons, but one of the primary reasons that it didn't get an Oscar nomination was it was too long for your average audience member. I
Mhm.
think it probably could have been edited down. A lot of those long tracking nature shots, as beautiful and immersive as they were, I think your average audience member is probably looking for like 2 hours rather than three, So I do think it could have used that. And something I would have liked to see, because I was familiar with the story of Blessed Franz Jägerstätter since high school. And I always thought this is compelling material. A guy who refuses to sign the oath of fealty to Hitler, and he has to pay the ultimate price for it. Spoiler alert, I guess. Yeah, I thought it'd make a great movie. But one thing I would have liked to have seen him do more of is more of his former life. We saw the saint. We didn't see the sinner. He was actually the leader of a motorcycle gang, fathered a child out of wedlock, and I think he spent some time in jail.
Wow.
And they allude to that briefly, but a lot of that was kind of sanitized, and maybe to its detriment, because I think people would they might be able to connect to that a little bit more. A lot
Mhm.
of times saints are very unrelatable because we're not seeing, the operations of grace in their life. That he was a bit of a ruffian. He was kind of a cad, and God was able to take that broken glass and shine a light through it.
It's interesting that sounds like he was a bit of a rebel in his youth. I wonder if being a saint requires a bit of rebelliousness. I mean, it certainly does to the world, but I was recently reminded of Dr. James Dobson, the Protestant. What was he? He was a child psychologist? I'm drawing a blank. It's been so long since I had even thought about him, but then it was brought up by by an old friend of mine who I still follow on social media, and she grew up Protestant, and then became, I don't know if she's like agnostic or deist or Irish Celtic pagan. I'm not sure what she is, but she was reliving some old trauma with Dr. James Dobson and how he really used the term strong-willed child in a very derogatory sense. And I thought, like, wait a minute, wasn't St. Paul strong-willed?
St. Peter, you could name any of them. You know what you're saying there, Aaron.
Well, but I think it's an interesting window into modern society of this sort of sense of docility, and it's a very fascinating question. Like, should we submit with docility to the zeitgeist of the age? And I think it's at first, the Catholic would say no, but I think it's a very complicated question, because it's like, well, on the one hand, no, you shouldn't submit to worldliness. You should seek God. But at the same time, it's like, yeah, but if you get a job, like, shouldn't you be somewhat docile to your superior? Shouldn't you be like, I mean, especially if you join a religious order, you definitely have to be docile to your superior. You have to be obedient. So, but I think that the answer to that question lies in the finding in the temple, where Christ was going about his Father's work, and so he was being docile and obedient, but it was to God, not to the world. But it's complicated, because sometimes being docile to God requires you to be docile to. I'm talking in circles, aren't I?
No, I totally know where you're coming from. I mean, I think the best answer I have, at least from Scripture, is when Jesus says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. It can be a fine line, and it's a case by case thing. I think obviously within reason we should exercise obedience to our superiors, whether in work or in family life or what have you, but not at the violation of our conscience.
Right. Yeah, you summed up very well what it took me like 5 minutes to try and get to, and I couldn't even get to it. So.
Hey, this is the peripatetic school of philosophy here. It's like we got Aristotle and Plato, the one pointing up, the other pointing down, and meet somewhere in the middle of the school of Athens.
There we go. Well, we can't get too
toot our own horn too much, but
we can't get too philosophical for the audience, because they. I
think people crave it. I don't know. Sometimes I think literature is like philosophy in action.
Yeah.
And I had an argument years ago on Twitter actually about this with some, they were Catholic friends, for lack of a better term, but they made the argument that, well, Jesus never wrote anything, because St. Francis de Sales, the patron saint of writers, he says we can have no better reason for anything we do than because our Lord did it. And of course, he wrote a lot of books. My counter to that was, well, I mean, he did tell St. John to write the book of the Apocalypse. We have that's in Scripture. And even Scripture itself, if he is indeed the incarnate Word, well, is not Scripture the Word of God? That's a book. I mean, obviously, secular literature, even of a faith-based orientation, is still not, on par with the Scripture or sacred tradition. But this notion that's crept in recently, and it could be partly because we're in such an imagistic age, is there's a sort of like anti-literacy or anti-literalism kind of movement afoot. And I don't know. I mean, I think it's very adjacent, or at least tangential, to a sort of anti-intellectualism that the
Mhm.
church has often been accused of, where particularly in the sciences, like, they like to hold up examples of like Galileo or what have you as, oh, we're enemies of free thought. And I don't see that at all. Even in, this is a kind of totally taking the conversation in a different direction, but you look at Galileo, it wasn't so much that, Saint Robert Bellarmine opposed his views. It was in opposition to proclaiming a what was then a theory as a fact. So
Mhm.
it was as much in favor of the scientific method as it was, in terms of like biblical literalism.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I wanted to ask you, uh, going back to the your Galahad
Mhm.
novel, what do you hope that readers will take away from it? So after they read it, how do you envision people's lives being changed by reading this book? I mean, maybe that's too much to expect from a book, but
Yeah, I don't
I
I don't
always I
think so. I
always
mean,
think
maybe it's
I always think of that.
ambitious. I read something earlier today to the effect that if you write for one person, you'll speak to everyone. If you write for everybody, you'll speak to no one. And I think there's a kernel of truth to that aphorism. So, I think first and foremost, it was a spiritual journey of self-discovery for me as the author. I think, and this is going to sound very Jungian, explore the depths of the communal subconscious here, but
Mhm.
you have to encounter your shadow self. Everyone has like the feminine or the masculine, the animus, the anima. I think there's a lot of that going on under the surface at kind of like this chthonic level. But I would hope that it is somehow cathartic, for an audience, for a reader to pick it up, that if they've ever felt hidden, go back to that theme of, the rebellion of a hiddenness or a not being known. If mysticism is to have any hold on people, I think there is this interior knowledge that there is one who knows us, and calls us by a name unknown by anyone else. For Catholics, for Christians, we believe that is Christ, that is God. And if the book can act as an icon that points in that direction, I think it could be very fruitful reading. Maybe on a more contemplative level than a strictly, entertainment based. I mean, ideally, we're telling a story. We're here to have fun, so it should be entertaining. But I would hope that it's edifying and hopefully even enlightening.
What did you learn while writing and publishing the book? So how did your creative process as a writer grow and develop while you wrote this book? And what did you learn about publishing when you published the book?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we're living in a digital media age, whether we like it or not. And the reality is, uh, it can still be good for networking. I think a lot of times people think, well, we have digital media now, we don't need a network. I think networking is more important than ever. A college friend, great author by the name of Danny Fitzpatrick, he connected me with his publisher, who he had met in graduate school at Holy Apostles Seminary over in Connecticut. I think he was doing a remote program. And so he connected us, and he really liked the material I was working with, because when he was doing doctoral studies, my publisher, I believe his dissertation was on something Arthurian. It was an Arthurian codex, the Matter of Britain, for those in the know. So it's a lot correlating a lot of the historical elements to the more fictive mythic elements. And so he really, liked the story, and so it was really just kind of a meeting of the minds. I think a big part of it, though, the whole process of putting the book together, It was nice working with a smaller kind of cottage press. He's got a pretty lean and mean team, because I had more creative input for the design, both of the cover and also the illustrations. And so, we use public domain, but because there's been so many iterations of the Arthurian myth, there was actually a lot of public domain images to use. And, I tweaked them and finessed them and kind of, gave it a unifying aesthetic. But I think it made it a very professional product, and also more attractive for the reader, in the sense of, I don't know about you, even if I'm not watching a movie adaptation, if I'm reading a book, I find like having a visual prompt at the start of every chapter helps me really immerse myself into the world that the author is creating, and paints a picture in the mind's eye. So that really came together in a way that was providential. That would be the only word that I would describe it.
Excellent. How do you approach the writing process? Is there a way that maybe makes you unique, sets you apart from other writers? Would you say that you tend to follow a lot of the conventions of writing, or do you like branch off and forge your own path, kind of thing? And there's no right or wrong answer. I want to clarify that some people are more conventional in their artistic approach, and that's fine, and others are, like myself, are a little more go their own way. So
you're a surrealist.
yeah.
The realist surrealist. Well,
surrealism with the goal of shining a light on realism not ordinarily experienced.
There we go. I like that definition.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm reminded of James Joyce, what he said when he said, the measure of any work of art is the depth of life from which it springs. I think it pairs quite well with a quote from, I want to say, Arthur Miller of The Crucible. He said that the best writing is always that which is on the verge of embarrassing the author. So I think there is a sort of self-disclosure that's where the vulnerability and the courage of the artist comes in. Sometimes it's easy to use historical themes as a mask, but I do think that if you can, learn from the great authors of the past and build on what they worked and make it personal to you, then what do they say? There's no new stories. There's just old stories told in new ways. So if you can ground your inspiration in lived experience, whether you derive that inspiration from something that's happened to you, something that happened to somebody else, or something that you've read or seen, if you can tie that to your own experience, it almost is like method acting, where with method acting, an actor might be put in a situation that they have not and never will be put in real life. But if they can tie the emotions that situation might produce to their own lived emotions and memories and experiences, the Stanislavski method, then they can create a real moment. And I think writers do the same thing, except through the medium of the written word.
Glad you brought up acting. I'm reading a book called Audition by a famous casting director mostly on the stage, but I think he might have done some in the film side as well. But yeah, they definitely talk about that, drawing on your own emotions. And I've often wondered in my own writings, like how much should it be from me, and how much should it be instead like about other people. So a lot of the themes that I write, they're not explicitly about me, but it always comes from me, if that makes any sense. But sometimes I feel a little insecure about that, because I think that, well, shouldn't I be like immersing myself in the lives of other people and writing about other people? And if I did that, wouldn't it be more altruistic. And since it all comes from me, isn't that kind of like a selfish way of writing? But I don't know the answer to that. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't think it's selfish. I mean, I think a lot of great artists have been narcissists and for very relatable reasons because, there is a degree of self-absorption and self-involvement, or what I like to say, like a strong interior life. There's an
Mhm.
interiority that comes with the profession of being an author, being an artist. Um, but if you can project your inner world in a way that's relatable for others, I think it's actually profoundly self-giving and self-sacrificial in a sense, because in your vulnerability, they're able to be vulnerable.
Mhm.
And I've seen that even with the Galahad work. Readers have reached out to me and said that they related to this aspect, or they related to this aspect. Maybe this reminded them of something going on in their family situation, or maybe this reminded them of some disappointment or frustration that they experienced. And so, if the author can connect, you know, their own feelings with the source material, I think it makes it easier for a reader or viewer, in the case of the film, to connect their lives to the source material. Now, I mean, I do think that the medium, the words technically are images, but word versus image is important here because, I think it was the great Russian filmmaker Tarkovsky who said, when 1,000 people read a book, they've read 1,000 different books.
Mhm.
Where a film is a little bit, it leaves less to the imagination. So for better or worse, when two people watch a movie, they share a memory now. So that's a limitation, but that's also an opportunity. And yeah, so coming back to your question, the selfishness of like, well, of self-disclosure, and how should that connect to the audience? Yeah, I agree with Rod Serling. You can get inspiration from anywhere, so
Mhm.
there's no, but the artist is almost like a radio antenna in a way that, we have all this signal to noise ratio. And if you can filter out that frequency so that somebody can tune in, and you're on the same wavelength, that can create a very, a special connection.
Yeah. I like your point about filtering out noise, because I think that really encapsulates the job of the artist. And you put that into words, whereas I've known that for a long time, but haven't been able to articulate it, because I think I think with a lot of beginner screenwriters, for example, I think a lot of them tend to include a lot of just like noise, a lot of like what they think is just being real, but it's actually noise. Like, for example, I read in the book The Screenwriter's Bible that film dialogue in particular is not supposed it's supposed to have a facade of being real, but it's not supposed to be real.
Mm-hmm.
You don't include tangents, you don't include little anecdotes, you don't include no, you cut everything down to what moves the plot forward and what really reveals the character. So it's not real. And so in a sense, like, and if you think about a broader I always think of like an artist having a broader not broader more refined, like unified vision for the piece. And when you find that vision, then your job becomes, as you mentioned, filtering out the noise, everything that's not relevant to that vision. And I think in order to have a great work of art, you need that vision. But I think that's lost in modern day creativity, because there's a lot of emphasis on the new random breakout idea, that comes from brainstorming. And don't get me wrong, brainstorming is important, but I think we've reduced creativity to just brainstorming. And brainstorming is great, but brainstorming on its own can generate a lot of noise. And when you pick an idea, it's not just because it sounds cool. No, it's because you have a you have that unified, refined vision, and you pick the ideas that fit in with that, that build that up, that make that vision louder rather than drown it out in a sea of endless possibilities. But I think when people think creativity, though, they think endless possibilities. I think just like time to play. It's like, yeah, you play, but at the end of the day, you have to like package that into
Hmm.
something cohesive. Uh, yeah, what do you think about that?
Well, that was very poetically put there, and I guess it leads me to the question of writer's block. Have you experienced like a creative blockage that you had a hard time snapping out of? And if and when you did snap out of it, what was your means for doing that?
I actually don't get writer's block that frequently. Maybe that's a sign that I'm not doing the process right. Um, because I usually, I don't know, maybe I've just developed this habit of just pushing forward, regardless. Although I have to admit, I've been using Gemini a lot for not the end product, but for like research and development for screenwriting, script writing in particular, and that really helps. I think eliminate a lot of writer's block because, and maybe that's the key to writer's block. Maybe if you are if you object to using AI, you can just use Google, and just research and read and feed your intuition. And when you've become satiated enough, then you can just write freely, and there's material and ideas, or go out, maybe it's not research. I think, what was it? I read or heard that there were like 3 ways to uh, get information for writing. One was research. That's what it was: research, experience, and then imagination. So research, or go out and travel the world and meet new people and listen to their stories. Or if you have a vivid imagination, just conjure up a bunch of stuff. And for me, it's a lot of, I don't like to go out and have new experiences. So it's just too risky for me, in my opinion. So I do a lot of like, I'll imagine a concept, and then now with Gemini, I'll be like, what can you tell me about these themes, this concept, what its implications are, what have writers written about this topic? And then I'll have a back and forth between that. Then that'll feed my imagination, and then the imagination will come up with another idea, and then I ask Gemini, give me some feedback on that. So it's a really enriching way of writing. And then when I write the final product, it's never with AI. Even though AI has gotten so much better at writing polished works, I still want to have authorship over it. Like, I want it to be me. I want it to be my artistic voice. I don't want it to be a computer. To me, you're not really being an artist. It's just my opinion. You're not really being an artist if you use AI for the final product. I mean, well, with a caveat, I have to say sometimes in my videos for seraphic content, or microfilms as I call them, I will use AI and say, hey, can you suggest some visuals to come up with this? But I still retain quite a bit of um, an authorial guiding hand in what it comes up with, and then I'll be selective about it. I'll pick and choose what I use, or maybe that idea will spring another idea. Although lately I've been like just seeing what it comes up with to generate ideas, and then just throwing it all away and coming up with my own stuff. So, but AI is another topic that for another day. So I wanted
Yeah,
to
if
ask.
I could say something to that, I
Yeah, go
think
ahead.
it's like it's great as like a sounding board. Like if you're, you know,
Yeah.
creating like a mood board, kind of boilerplate stuff. I did develop, you know, speaking of writer's block, a computer program the other day, based on Brian Eno's card game. He's like a British new wave musician, and he created his own deck of cards called Oblique Strategies, that each of them had like a random a statement on them. So if a musician or lyricist was getting stuck, you know, in the creation of an album, they could draw a card from the deck, and maybe that would snap them out of it. So I kind of created an automatic version of it. But even that approach, it's interesting because, you know, you look at like the music of like U2 or David Bowie or Coldplay, they all used this method. So there might be something to it. I don't know. I haven't used it myself, but I was thinking of looking into that.
Yeah.
I'm like you, Aaron. I've got too much going on up here, down there, that I don't experience writer's block that often. I think it's one of those things where, you know, if you're invoking the Holy Spirit, hopefully it draws your attention to the stories that need telling. You know, Christ, the way he communicated with souls was through means of parables. So I think it's a sacred activity, creativity. And J.R.R. Tolkien, one of, you know, the paragons of Catholic authorship, you know, he talks about how we're participating in an extension of God's creation via this act of subcreation, you know, and he created his own world. Now, I read a quote from him the other day that was very interesting and made me think. I mean, God bless him, but he might have been, you know, on the autism spectrum, because he said he wrote Middle Earth to support the language that he had invented. So he wanted to create a world where his language was beautiful. But I, you know, as an author myself now, I love that personally. I think, you know, sometimes we can get lost in the message and we forget the medium. Just to delight in the medium for its own sake, you know, that's fine as far as it goes, and it only goes so far. But that is important, and that is a big part of the craftsmanship. Is just, you know, you think of a woodworker. I think they love working with wood, and then, you know, they can, you know, realize a bigger artistic vision. But that first love of just the material itself, the medium, almost precedes the message in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. So for others who want to become a published author, such as yourself, what would your advice be to them?
Yeah, you know, I would say this is going to sound kind of curt, but I believe it was William Golding. He wrote The Princess Bride, if you're familiar with that film at all.
Oh yes.
William Goldman, maybe. I always confuse Golding. Golding wrote The Lord of the Flies. Very different book. You know, but he was a struggling writer, like all writers at one point in his life. I think he was living in New York City, and he just published his first book, but it really wasn't getting many sales. He later, you know, had success with Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, you know, with Robert Redford and Paul Newman. And his advice, I took it seriously, and to this day I take it seriously. He said, write and pray. And he wasn't even Catholic. I think he's Jewish, but he said, write and pray, meaning, you know, keep writing as a discipline, almost like as a prayer-like discipline, and pray that it finds the reader it's supposed to find. And I don't think there's any, you know, he's also famous for saying a couple of other things, like in Hollywood nobody knows anything. And so, you know, he was saying that in the 1960s. If it was true then, I think it's, you know, probably even truer now with the kind of the obsolescence of the studio system. So yeah, I think, and again, Rod Serling, you know, the creator of the Twilight Zone series, you know, he said because he got asked the same question when he was delivering a talk at UCLA shortly before his death. He said, well, his first response was, do you have an uncle who works at Warner Brothers? Like, you know, it's nice to have connections. But his second response was, you know, if what you're creating is good, it will get discovered. That's just how it works. And I always had kind of a faith in that, and I continue to have a faith in that. So I think the biggest thing is, because a lot of people, they still have to have a job to earn a living. That there's no shame in that. William Faulkner, I think he worked at the post office. Wasn't very happy doing it. So did Charles Bukowski. So he did his stint there. But he said, if you are called to be a writer, not having enough time for it will not be an excuse. You will make time for it. That's, and I think that's true.
So keep your head down, keep writing, improve your craft, pray, and have an uncle at Warner Bros. Cool. Well, the pray part leads me to my next question is, how does faith influence your work?
I wouldn't necessarily say that work is my faith, but I think my faith is very verbal. I mean, I think you can tell even from our conversation right now. All the saints say you should, especially Teresa of Avila, that you should, and she was a great writer herself with her Interior Castle, one of the first female doctors of the church, that you should foster a sort of filial conversation with God, talking to him as if he's your best friend. So, that's kind of the whole Carmelite quote from the Psalms, our conversation is in heaven. And for me, literature is a form of prayer where, it is the soul communicating with God, who is the eternal word, all caps, by means of our human word. So I'm really a fan of Father Eddie Doherty. He was a Oscar award-winning screenwriter of The Brothers Sullivan. It was the story of these four brothers who all went down heroically with the ship in World War II, Irish American. And he wrote the movie about them, and that got an Oscar. He later had a life reversion. He was married to a woman from Russia, and he, even though he was, Irish Catholic, he became Melkite, so he became a priest, even though he was married. And they started the Madonna House Apostolate. I think it was in Canada. I want to say Ontario, which I'm pretty sure that one of the most famous Catholic authors now, Michael O'Brien, is affiliated with. And I think his last words or his epitaph was "all my words for the word," with the capital W. And that's kind of my motto too, that, it's the truth is, it speaks the world into existence from a place of silence, and learning that the silence of God is not an indication of his absence, but rather of his presence, that people who are silent, they're listening. So a lot of times I think people think, where is God in all this and all the evil in the world? How could he allow this? And, if, he says, I would speak to you not with the clanging cymbal, but the whisper of the wind. You realize that, when any living thing suffers, God is suffering as well. And he's listening in silence. And so I think if our words can point to that sort of deeper reality, it's almost like St. Faustina Kowalska of Poland said, that, you can be exteriorly very talkative, but interiorly you can have silence and peace. And a lot of times people who are exteriorly silent, they're not saying anything, but interiorly they're in turmoil. And so I think literature it mediates that whole relationship.
Absolutely. Do you have any hobbies?
Too many to count.
Not to come out of left field, but
I'll tell you my latest. I've been working in charcoal and parchment. You may have seen some of my drawings, sketches, rubbings. That's been very gratifying because it's so old tech, it's so primitive, but you have such a contact with the material. It's very manual. It's not abstract. It's not overly intellectual. So yeah, I like the visual arts, not just the verbal ones. How about you, Aaron? What are your latest hobbies?
Oh, the closest thing I have to hobbies would be um, probably cooking, which I don't do
That's an
enough
art.
of.
That's an art you can
Uh,
eat.
it's mostly, I'm a very intuitive kind of person, so I don't like recipes. If I use a recipe, it's only to get ideas, not to follow it verbatim. So I'm very much just like shoot from the hip, go from my, rely on my memory of how different things taste and just put them together in ways that I think works. And usually it works. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes, oops, that was a little too much cinnamon. So there's that. I don't know if you'd call it a hobby, but I love listening to world folk music.
Oh, you're an audiophile. You got
Yeah.
the headphones for it.
Yeah, these are actually Sennheiser. I forget what they're called. They're like $400 headphones.
Fancy.
I bought them because I discovered that not only at the same time as I was upgrading my monitor game so that what I see on the monitor is I can have confidence is correct. I needed to have the same thing with audio. So
I
$400
totally get it.
headphones, and they're really amazing. I love these headphones. Um, but yeah, and even though I'm most known as a colorist, it's little known that I do also obsess to a lesser degree over getting the perfect dialogue processing. I film dialogue, voiceovers, mostly voiceovers these days, but just getting the perfect signal chain in the audio software. So I've put in some time with that. I just love crisp yet rich um, vocals, stuff.
Texture.
Yeah, and it's like as with color, it's not as easy to get as it should be, but it's actually a lot easier to get um, the aesthetic I'm looking for with my audio. It's easier to do that than it is to get the aesthetic that I was trying to achieve with color. It took so much longer, and there's a lot of things that I'm not sure what's going on, but it just happens to work. So it's kind of like Egyptian medicine.
Serendipitous.
Yeah. I'm very unscientific. Like I'm part of a couple colorists forums, and they're all just so like fastidious,
Granular.
fastidious and almost neurotic about the details. They're just like, then they get so sensitive about, like if somebody says something wrong, it's like, what's the matter with you? Like, how dare you? Like no, this is the way it's supposed to be. Educate yourself, you ignorant, whatever you want to call it. It's like, oh, okay,
The Philistines.
I'm sorry.
Well, on that note, I don't know. Anything else you got planned for today, or?
Um, like me personally, or for the
Oh, in
conversation?
general, yeah.
Oh, doing some more refining of heart color. I want to see if I can eke out some more subtlety and shading. Which right now it's a 12 primary system. I've had 24 primary systems before, but just because there's so many nodes with the current version, it's hard to do 24 systems with the same kind of 24 primary system with the same treatment. So, but I'm going to see if I can do kind of a reduced treatment on these next 12 primaries and see if that actually improves anything or if it's just a wild goose chase. So I've got that.
Yeah, you'll have to keep me updated with that. I think it's definitely got it reminds me of the chiaroscuro of the classical masters in painting.
Chiaroscuro. Was that pattern light? Is that what that
Kind
means?
of. It's like light and shadow. You know,
Yeah.
very vibrant, very vibrant.
It's very vibrant. And I'm trying to find. I also need to like tone down the skin tones just a little bit more. Like not a lot more. I still want them vibrant, more vibrant than my critics can endure. But
Well, if you have no critics, you're not doing something right. So
that's what they say, you know. It's like the more right you become, the more suffering you endure, right?
well, it's been great chatting with you today.
Yeah, thanks for
We'll have to do this
appearing.
again soon.
Yeah. Really wonderful to hear about your book. You know, it's always every day you hear a published author, and wish you the best. Is there a place where our audience can find your work?
Yeah, I think i if they follow me on X at Illumine Domini,
Okay.
it's INLUMINEDOMINI. That is a mouthful. It's like a cryptic cipher, but it means in the light of the Lord. Uh, that's what we're
Excellent.
living for.
Excellent. Well, everyone, follow Michael on Twitter, and then until next time, we're still working out the details of this fireside chat. We hope to have it monthly, but there might be a few gaps as we get this working. Michael Snellen was not able to join us today. He had other engagements, but hopefully in the future we will iron this out. And if you wish to be a guest of a future show, please message either myself on mostly this will be shown on Mighty, but message myself or message Michael Snellen, and we will get you on. So until then, thanks for tuning in.